kick it off. Without any further ado, I'm just going to quickly steal the screen, a couple of PowerPoint slides, and then we will hand it over. 2 secs. Just go ahead and share. All right, can everybody see that? Everyone see my screen?
Looks
Yep, cool beans. Yep, cool. Yeah, just in Teams. All right. G'day and welcome everybody to the Brisbane Infrastructure DevOps User Group for what are we in now? June, fair income, end of financial year in a couple of days. Welcome everybody. We're going to be kicking off. So again, we're sponsored by Hudson Recruitment. If you're looking for a good job, if you're looking for something that potentially is, a really good custom fit, these guys are really, really good. I can attest to that. They've fit me in previous role. If you think recruitment, think Hudson. And then finally, we have ScriptRunner. Basically, ScriptRunner, they are paying up meetup costs. They also do a couple of awesome talks. Last month, Wayne did a talk about Azure automation. ScriptRunner essentially is just a PowerShell, a very similar implementation of PowerShell or Azure automation, except way better. So if you're thinking about PowerShell automation in your environment, consider ScriptRunner and give that a go because you'll be pleasantly surprised. Also, with regards to that, ScriptRunner will be presenting in a couple of months, so we'll get to see what's been changed within the couple of months, and it's always something that's really, really cool. All right, next up in July, that's next month, we're going to have a talk from our Australian in Western Australia, Mr. Glenn Sarti. Glenn's going to be basically doing a talk about docs, if I believe, docs with UIX. If I recall, that's what it is. Glenn's probably going to be on and correcting me immediately soon. But yes, Glenn's going to be presenting next month about UI and docs. So definitely consider that attending. It's going to be good. Alrighty, let's carry on. And that is pretty much it for me. So what I'm going to do is hand it over to you, Jordan. Our esteemed guest, Jordan Abordine. He is one of the most knowledgeable people that I know about PowerShell, and he works as a Red Hat developer at Ansible. And yes, he's probably the forefront person who understands more about WinRM than possibly Microsoft. So without a further ado, here's Jordan.
Hey. Cool. Thanks, Michael. As Michael was saying, I'm a software engineer that works for Red Hat, and I'm on the Ansible core team. So I deal with a whole bunch of products like the actual Ansible, the Windows collections for Ansible that are on there, and then some of the other things that are sort of separated into the different teams. I have a few things that I sort of touch on, but I do like to play with PowerShell, and I've been dabbling in C# recently, so I'm sort of branching out and trying different things as I go along and whatever sort of catches my fancy. But today, basically, I'm going to be talking about Ansible and Windows and how you can use it to set up a domain environment, as well as just giving a brief demonstration of what you can actually do with that domain environment and some of the new features that we sort of recently added. So I'll sort of just get straight into it because some of these steps are a bit long running. So I'll kick that off by showing you, and then I'll sort of talk you through what's happening on there. So I'm sharing my screen now. Is the text size good? Does it need to be increased, decreased, or anything like that? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to kick it off this step here because it's going to take a while to run, and I'll talk through what's actually happening as it's going through. So essentially, I've got a test environment here. This one here has 4 servers. I've got a Linux server, which is where Ansible is running. I've got a domain controller. I have a SQL server, and I have an app server. All these are just created through Vagrant, so it's a HashiCorp product. You could technically use Ansible to build that if you wanted to, but I find Vagrant is quite nice, and I've got a few images out there, so it's just very easy to spin up new servers and everything like that. Essentially, I'm right now connected to the actual Linux server, which is where Ansible is running from. Unfortunately, Ansible does need to run on a non-Windows host. It uses some functions and setups that isn't available on Windows. So you could run it on WSL if you want to. It just can't run natively on Windows itself. So as it's going on here, I've got my domain setup folder. In this case here, I have a main.yaml file. So YAML is what Ansible playbooks and tasks are written in. Main is a sort of a common convention to say, hey, this is the one that you run in this folder, or it's sort of the entry point that we have on there. I could call it whatever I want. It's sort of just up to you how you want to do it. In this case here, my main.yaml is doing a few things. The overarching solution for this one here is to be able to set up a domain environment. So that includes installing the domain controller, Active Directory features on the DC. It's joining the various hosts to that actual domain itself. And it's also doing some setup on the actual Linux host to be able to easily talk to that domain controller to do things like Kerberos authentication, as well as sort of just name resolution that's happening on there. So in this playbook here, playbooks are divided into certain sections called plays. So in YAML, that's sort of the first element that we have on here. We can give it a nice, simple name. So in this case here, set up CA certificates is my first play. If I go into the output that started running here, I see as we started, so we're calling our playbook. It's telling us here, okay, this is the play that's running. So we can see sort of step by step where this actual playbook is currently up to. As we go on to the next step, we have a whole bunch of tasks in this play. Currently, it's running all on localhost, so it's actually running on the same host that Ansible is running from. So I'm making changes right now locally. The first step is that we're creating a directory called cert setup, and we're just sort of giving it the state. So as it's run here, it's giving us the output. It's showing us in yellow that it's actually changed. So when you run it through, it will tell you what has changed, what hasn't changed, red is error, and it gives us a whole bunch of different information. So like it's showing us the path, the mode of the actual folder, as well as a whole bunch of different things on there. As we go on to the next step, we're calling a different one here called the script module. In this case here, it's calling something called generate cert. This one here is just simply a bash script that I've got written that's located next to the actual playbook itself. So I've got generate cert here. What this is doing is it's generating a CA certificate as well as some certificates issued by that one there for use later in the actual function. So that's basically the first steps. As we've gone here, we have a new block here. So if we collapse this, we can see that that whole play is done. So in this next play here, we're setting up the domain prerequisites. So it's just doing some sort of setup work on there. We're targeting the Windows hosts. So all the windows in my inventory will be on there. And then once again, it goes through the various facts. So the first one is it's going to get some network connection info. So I'm getting my network name as well as the IP address. So if I scroll a bit further down, we can see here that on the SQL01 host, it's giving me my IP as well as the network name. On the domain controller, it's giving me, once again, the IP and name. And finally, my third Windows host is app01, and we get our IP and name. You may have noticed that this one here is green instead of yellow, and it has an OK text on here. What this means is that this particular task here didn't actually register any change happen. So either the task is just sort of a read-only thing, or it is idempotent and it's detected that the state is already on there. It doesn't have to make a change. So that's sort of a nice way to see that whether steps have either been redone or a change has occurred or whether nothing has actually happened. From there, we just take that raw information into sort of easy to use variables. So instead of using this somewhat complicated where we're sort of getting the output and properties on there, we're just setting it to a variable called public connection name and public connection IP. If we scroll down in the output, we can see that our setFac, it's just doing that same thing. So it's just showing us that it's setting those variables for those particular hosts to those actual values. From there, it's going into a copy step. So we've got this action here called WinCopy. By default, WinCopy enables you to copy files that's actually on the Ansible host towards the target host. So in this case here, it's copying a file called ca.pem that's adjacent to our actual playbook. So if you look in our cert setup, we can see a whole bunch of files, and we have a CA certificate here. So what this particular task here is going to do, it's going to take this file and copy it to this destination directory on all the Windows hosts that it's currently targeting. So in this case here, it's copying it to DC01, app01, and SQL01. Once it's copying, it's going to do a certificate operation. So it's actually going to import that certificate into the root local machine store. Once again, it does that. It's yellow to show that it's an actual change. The reason why I'm doing this one here is that we've got a CA certificate that's going to be trusted by all the hosts in this particular configuration. In a real world, I probably would be using like an Active Directory domain, a certificate services, or an actual proper CA. This is sort of just for testing, and it's just an ease of use type of thing. So once this play is actually done, we go into the next step here where we're actually creating the domain controller. So in this way, we're starting a new play. It's targeting DC01 only, so we're not running it on all the Windows hosts. It's just running it on the one. The first step is it's configuring some DNS stuff. So it's using that public connection name fact that we set previously in a play, and it's setting the DNS server as just a local host. So it's just sort of a prerequisite there. In this next step here, which is what it's currently up to, it's promoting this particular server as a domain controller and setting up the actual forest and all that information here. So in this case here, we're providing the domain name through a variable called domain name. We're setting the safe password to domain password. This is sourced from the inventory, which I'll show you shortly. We're also telling it that once this actually operation has happened, you're free to actually reboot this host here. So this is a particular long step, which is why I kicked it off when I first started. So we can see here that it's still currently running, and it's going to do that for a few more minutes. So while this one is running, I'll briefly talk about the actual inventory. So the inventory right now that we have is an INI file. It has a whole bunch of host information as well as variables that we've got set here. Currently, we're defining all three Windows hosts. So currently, it can resolve through the Hyper-V network, through the mshome.net domain. So we've got them defined there. Two of them have like host-specific variables. So app01 is part of the app servers OU. SQL01 is part of the SQL servers OU and is defined through the domain OU name. If we go back to our actual playbook, if we look a bit further down, we can see that we're referencing this variable here through the app01 or SQL01 variable. So that's how you can access these things, and the hosts have got that name associated with it. The inventory groups those three hosts together under a group called Windows. This is sort of just a common convention that we have, but you can call this anything that you want. So it doesn't have to be Windows for Windows hosts. It's just what I've called it. So when I've got this group here called Windows, you may have saw before in the host here, that's what I'm targeting. So when I do this, that's going to target all three hosts in that particular group there. So that's how you can sort of segment your plays and sort of your actions towards particular hosts or particular groups, so you don't run them all at the same time. Hosts can be members of multiple groups. There's also sort of nested membership. So I can have Windows as part of like another group and so on. It doesn't have a complex hierarchy that you might have seen in tools like Puppet or Chef. It's a bit more simple, but it still is quite powerful for what you want to do. I've got another group here called domain members, where I've got my app01 and SQL01 also a member of. So these two hosts here are members of Windows. They're also members of domain members. So it's just another group that is part of. At the bottom here, I've got a few variables that I'm wanting to actually set. So on all the hosts that are part of the Windows group, I'm setting my connection username and password. I'm connecting the Ansible connection type. So in this case here, I'm using PSRP or PowerShell remoting. And then I'm also actually setting the port. With Windows, you do have to explicitly set PSRP, WinRM, or whatever one that you do want to do. Ansible defaults to SSH, which while Windows can technically support these days, it's designed specifically for Linux out of the box. So you still need to set a few different things to get that working with Windows. Basically, these are sort of special variables that are known to Ansible, so it knows how to actually set them back. And there's a whole bunch of other ones depending on your actual connection plugin that you want to use. Finally, I have a whole bunch of variables here under the all group. So this one here is special. It's basically saying that every single host that I have I want you to define these variables on all of those hosts. So I'm setting things like domain name. So in this case here, that's what I'm creating the domain as. You may have noticed that ginger2 block, all those mustaches that I like to call, you've got your 2 braces and the actual variable name here. So when Ansible runs, it's actually going to substitute this particular value with that variable that it got from the inventory. So basically, this task is the same as doing this, except for the actual values coming dynamically from the inventory source. There's a whole bunch of other things which will be used later in the task, but this one here is basically just sort of a setup task. So I'm not really too concerned about securing the variables or hiding them or anything like that. There are tools out there like Ansible Vault or Key Vault lookups that you can actually use to be able to do that. So while it's actually gone through that, we can see that it's now moving through all the various different tasks. If we look back up the top a bit to where it was from before, we can see that there said that there's a change. No reboot was required because the actual task itself rebooted as part of that. So we don't actually have to do any sort of async work or any sort of special operation to do that. The reboot happens and it's managed all internally in Ansible. As we're going through here, it's doing a whole bunch of other things. So it's creating organizational units through various variables. It's going to update some laps thing, which I'll show you a feature going on. So it's like updating the schema. You can see that this Win PowerShell thing is actually running PowerShell code in line. So if there's not a module available to do what you want, you can just run your PowerShell code. If you really want to go old school, you can use batch code as well. So you can really do whatever you want here. You can also create your own modules as well, depending on how adventurous that you want to do. But Win PowerShell is a fairly newer module that we've added. I find it's a nice sort of middle ground between writing modules and sort of just doing non-Ansible scripts. So it's a fairly nice thing to actually use. So it's going all the way down here. It's doing a whole bunch of tasks. You can see that it's all yellow. Some of them are green because they're sort of read-only operations. But as it's going through there, it's just going to continue along as I'm going through it. So once that setup is done, it's going to go on to the next task where it's joining those other Windows hosts within the domain. We can see here that host is now targeting domain members, which according to our inventory is Apo1 and SQL01. So if we scroll down a bit further to that play, you can see this play here. I know I went a bit too far, sorry. So the join the Windows host to the domain, we can see that this is running in parallel on both SQL01 and Apo1. So once again, this is doing a similar thing. It's setting up some DNS so it can actually talk to the domain. It's enabling the admin account, so laps will actually work. This one here is the actual code that will join the host to the domain itself. And once again, it has this reboot true operation, so it's able to handle the reboots internally for you, so you don't have to worry about it. And then it's just doing sort of a test to make sure that the domain actually join was successful and it's able to run as a particular user. We've got some sort of post actions happening on here. So in this case here, it's installing a certificate on the SQL server, which we'll use in a later task. So it's doing, once again, that win copy operation to set it copy across to the server and importing it into the actual system store. The last step that we have on here is it's configuring our local host, so our Linux server. It's doing things like installing our DNS operations, configuring DNS so it can actually talk to our domain controller by setting up files and other things like that. It's also doing some sort of basic Kerberos configuration. So this play should have finished by now. If you scroll all the way at the bottom, we can have this sort of play recap. So it's telling us all the hosts that it actually run on. It showed us, okay, all the okay ones, so the things that didn't change, the number that was on there, as well as the operations that changed, and then a whole bunch of other stuff on there. With Ansible, if you write your playbooks correctly, it has something called idempotency. So if I was to run this same script again, except for barring a bug for one particular task, but that's sort of inconsequential, everything is going to be okay. So this one here is changed due to a bug, which I need to fix, but everything else will be okay. Will state that no operation is actually performed. So you can run this as many times as you want without any sort of failures occurring, as long as it's actually written correctly. So you can see here that it's either skipping ones or things are all okay, and everything will be sort of good from there. So this particular setup here created that domain controller. We've got our inventory, which we sort of talked about before. The last one that we have here is an Ansible config file. So this can be set up in a whole bunch of different directories. I like to put it adjacent to my actual playbook because it can hold playbook configurations. I'm telling it that my inventory is that particular file there. If you don't want to, you don't have to define this in a config. You can provide it through like Ansible playbook -i inventory.ini and go from there. I don't like retry files myself. So if something would fail, we'll generate something called a retry file, and you can say, hey, start again from this particular operation. So I just sort of disable that. And I'm telling it to output as YAML. So if I wasn't to do that, this would be under JSON, which I'd probably find a bit harder to read. YAML's sort of nice in this aspect to sort of get those values. So that's sort of personal preference. You can do whatever you want on here. So you can see in that play recap, everything here is all good except for that one task I said has a bug, but everything else is all okay or skipped. So there's only one change that happened on there. So now that we've created this domain controller, we can actually ping it. So we've got dc01 frizzpug.test. Oh, I need to restart, sorry. Oh, I got a typo, which is why, sorry. Okay, cool. So it's able to ping it. We're getting that return reply on there. So we know that our DNS is sort of set up properly and everything's working. So now that we've actually set up a domain on there, we've got a whole bunch of other operations under this demo folder here. One of the cool things that we have is a dynamic inventory. So in this case here, before we had all our hosts defined explicitly in an inventory file, and that's how Ansible knew what host to talk to and how, but a dynamic inventory is able to source that information from an external source. So this LDAP plugin is a relatively recent addition to Ansible that was probably released in the last month or so. It's able to actually look up hosts as part of that Active Directory domain and build an inventory based on that one there. So in this case here, we're telling Ansible, okay, my plugin is microsoft.ad.ldap, which is the name of the actual plugin. So that's sort of just telling it, this is what this file is for. For all the hosts that we're retrieving, I want to get the object SID, the distinguished name, and I want to get my lapse attribute. So we can see that here, this is the encrypted value from AD. So we're able to actually decrypt that value on the fly for you. And I'm setting all these values to these particular facts. So object underscore SID, parent underscore OU, lapse user, and lapse password. The values on the right is how it's transforming the raw attribute. So this is just a placeholder to say, okay, the raw object SID that we get from that, pass it to this filter. So I'm going to convert it to an actual SID string because SIDs are stored as binary data in the domain. So I'm actually converting it to a string. In this case here, I'm getting the distinguished name and I'm extracting out that parent OU. So I'm getting this particular value here. Regex can get a bit messy. Typically, I would probably convert this to my own custom filter, but you can really do whatever you want on there. And then finally, for the lapse stuff, I'm saying I'm getting this and then the decrypted value. I'm converting it from JSON because that's how it's stored on there. And then lapse itself, the JSON has an N and a P key in there, which stores the username and password. So basically, I'm just saying, get this value, decrypt it, and store it to these variables in Ansible itself. Finally, at the bottom, we've got a group section. Okay, so we're saying that all the hosts that are coming from there, the value on this one here is true, which means assign it to the Windows. So basically, all the hosts are going to be part of a group called Windows. I have two other groups, app servers and SQL servers, and I'm saying, okay, app servers are only hosts that are in the app server's parent OU, or SQL servers in the parent OU. So basically, if app01 is in app servers, it's going to be a part of the app servers group and the SQL servers group. So if we were to run this one here right now, it is going to fail because I haven't done a particular step, but I'll just show you what that looks like. So I'm just calling Ansible inventory, which is a tool that's able to display those actual inventory hosts here. So we're getting a whole bunch of warnings on here saying it's unable to actually authenticate with the actual host. So no credentials were actually supplied. And then it didn't find any hosts because it wasn't able to. So I'm able to actually put in those credentials hard-coded inside it. But one thing that you can actually do is you can take advantage of Kerberos authentication. In this case here, I'm going to use a Kerberos command, which is kinit, and I'm going to get a ticket for my Kerberos user, my domain user, which I've actually created. So I'm doing vagrant domain as part of that domain itself. I'm going to type in that password, and then everything's all good. I can verify with klist. We can see that, okay, we've got a ticket for this particular principal here. So we're now able to run our Ansible inventory command, and we're going to get some output back. So we no longer have any warnings. We actually have hosts populated. We can see that we have our Apo1 host. We can see that the Laps password has been decrypted here, as well as the Laps username. We can see the distinguished name, so it's part of that app servers OU. We've got our domain controller, our SQL server, and we can see up the top here, we've got under the app servers, we've got Apo1 and SQL servers group, we have SQL 01. So I can retrieve any other attribute from LDAP on there that I want to. This is sort of just a basic example. You can filter this down to particular hosts using an LDAP filter or through like a particular base that you're wanting to look at. There's a whole bunch of things that you can actually use with this one here. So we've got all three hosts found. So Apo1, DC01, SQL 01. I've got a test playbook, which all it's doing is doing a win ping, which verifies that the connection all works. And then it's just going to display a variable. So if I was to run that test playbook, we can see here that it's connected to all three of those hosts. I have a bug that I need to fix in my thing. What did I call it instead? Oh, I don't know why that one's actually happening. I do need to look into that. But we can see here that it's able to actually connect to those three hosts in the inventory. And I don't have any of those host details hard-coded. It's all pulled dynamically from LDAP through this dynamic inventory here. So while that one is running, I'm going to run a playbook main again. What this one here is doing is that it's calling two different playbooks on there. So I can sort of separate this out into various files. So the first one is sql.yaml, then the second one is app.yaml. SQL.yaml is running specifically on the SQL host. So you can see that these particular tasks here, it's only running on SQL 01, not Apo1. And it's doing a whole bunch of things. It's creating an AD group called SQL admins. It's adding that vagrant user to it. It's going to do that idempotently. So as many times as I run it, it won't report an actual change unless one needs to occur. It's going to get that information from it. So it's going to retrieve that net login name. So just the domain SQL admins for use in later. It's going to template out a file called sqlinstall.ini and copy that towards this temporary directory here. This particular template is adjacent to the actual play. So under the templates folder, I have sqlinstall.ini, which refers to this source here. What this is just basically the SQL install configuration file. The reason why I have done template is that inside the file itself, it has a templatable value. So when I get to it, where was it? So in this case here, we have the Brisbane PUG SQL admins, and that's going to template out in there. That's actually a bug that should be. Sorry, when I was testing this, I didn't realize I hard-coded that one in there. So in this case here, we've got a Jinja 2 block, so the two braces, and then the expression inside it, which will expand out. So When this file is copied across the actual remote host, it's going to get the value of this, which is what we have here registered before. It's going to place that in the file and then copy it across the actual remote host itself. So this is quite useful if you've got configuration files that have environment-specific settings across all your various environments. You can set those information however you want, really. So once it's done that on there, it's going to use this module called WinPackage to install SQL Server. So right now I'm just saying download this exe directly from the internet. Internally, you probably would have that stored in a file share or your own sort of Artifactory type of operation. Basically, it's going to say that install that with these particular arguments. So quiet, accept license terms, and use that configuration file that I've copied across there. SQL is a bit finicky with installation. It does a whole bunch of things like accessing the DP API store, as well as sort of quite privileged host operations. In this case here, to sort of bypass that those issues, I'm using something called become in Ansible. Basically, for this task, I'm saying, hey, start to use become. For Windows, the become method is run as. On Linux and Mac OS, you have sudo, do as, and a whole bunch of other ones that are available, but Windows is just run as. And I'm saying the user to actually become, so run this operation under this particular user, is those lapsed credentials that we've gotten. So in this case here, the installation is actually happening as part of that local administrator account, which is all that information I've sourced from AD. It's the credentials. I haven't hard-coded these credentials anywhere inside this one here. It's all pulled dynamically as part of that dynamic inventory. Once it's done, it's saying, hey, reboot if a reboot was reported. In this case here, there wasn't actually one, so a reboot required was false, so it skipped that step. But the Win reboot is a sort of a nice option that you have on there is if the module doesn't support reboots internally. So you can still do that outside the module itself. Finally, it's going to do a whole bunch of things. So this is more PowerShell code in line to get the SQL Server certificate that we imported in the last play. It's going to do some permissions to be able to grant the actual SQL Server user access to that actual private key so it can be used. And then it's going to set some registry values. So we set our actual path, and we're going to set both these two values. So the certificate to the thumbprint we retrieved in the previous step, and force encryption to the value of 1. So if we look at that actual particular step, we can see here that that thumbprint was pre-filled from that previous step, and the force encryption 1 had actually run. So as it's going through there, it's going to restart the SQL service because we've made a change up above. We can see that we've got a when operation on it. So we can say only run this if SQL config. So this step above here is changed. So when a change is reported, so the next time that we run this, this actual service won't, this particular task won't run because it doesn't need to. We're going to open up some ports, and that's pretty much it for this particular step here. So we can see that everything ran, and then it continues on to the next play. So the next play is something quite simple. It was in that app playbook that we have on here. It's targeting the app servers, and it's going to use a module from the Chocolatey team called WinChocolatey. Basically, it's saying, hey, install this particular package through Chocolatey. So it's going to do choco.exe install this one here and make sure it's actually present. So we can see that everything's all good. It's reported some changes, which is expected for our first run. If we were to run this one again, we'll see that everything should be green because there shouldn't be any other changes. Everything's reported okay. So we see that it's sort of skipped through. It didn't have to restart the service because the registry stuff was already set, so it doesn't need to do that. And everything's all good. So that's installed our SQL service on the SQL Server and installed the Management Studio on there. So if we were to go and open up our application server, so app01, we'll log in under our domain user because we want to authenticate correctly. So if we see here, we've got our SQL Server Management Studio that has been installed. And then we're wanting to actually connect. So just to test to show you that the certificate was set up properly, we'll get the IP address of that particular SQL server. and we'll connect to that SQL Express instance. So if we connect to this one here, I think I've got the correct instance name. Eventually, it's going to complain to us saying that that identity can't be verified because the IP address doesn't match what's on the actual certificate. So we have an error. So we can either choose to, hey, trust the certificate regardless, but because we're good citizens, we're actually going to connect through the host name. And that particular certificate that we imported is trusted by this particular host. And it also has the SQL01 as part of the subject alternate names. We can see that we've actually connected to the actual host through that one there. So everything's sort of all hunky-dory. Another thing that we have there on the domain controller, so if we log into that particular host, once again, connect through our domain account. We'll open up our domain configuration, show some advanced stuff. We can see that one of the steps that we had was to create a group called SQL admins and to populate that with the Vagrant one. So we can see that the group exists. We can see that the Vagrant is part of that particular group. As part of joining the host, we created our app servers and SQL servers OU. So we have SQL01 and app01. And we can even see that Laps was successfully able to configure it. So we can see our Laps tab. We can get the plain text password. And the actual user from there. So sort of everything's sort of all configured from Ansible, and it's all sort of connected. I believe I've covered pretty much all that I wanted to do here. I know it's probably running a bit short, but I don't know if anybody else had any particular questions or wanted me to go over anything in particular.
There's actually a few questions that have been thrown in the chat. Wayne has the first question, which is a question for later. Can you explain line 64 in main.yaml? What's that dot notion, and is that line called?
Cool. Okay, I believe that's probably part of the setup one. So main.yaml line 64. Was it this one here?
Yeah, that's right, Jordan. I think you later called those plugins, but I'm not sure. You can tell me if that's right or not. But what is that Microsoft.ad.domain? What does that syntax mean?
So historically, when Ansible first started, we just had module names. So I would have done like WinCopy or WinFile : or if it's on Linux, file and stuff like that. Basically, this entry here is the actual, what we call either a module or an action plugin to run. With Ansible 2.9, which probably came out, I think maybe 3 years ago now, we introduced the concept of collections. And a collection has a namespace and a name. So in this case here, our namespace is Microsoft, the name is AD, and then the plugin inside that is called domain. So basically, what this is saying is run the domain module inside the Microsoft.ad collection. If we look at just the step above that here, we can see that there's the Ansible namespace, the Windows collection, and then the WinDNS client module that we have on there. So it's just running those particular ones on it. Does that answer your questions for that?
It does, yeah. Can I follow up with a couple more? Just really quick ones.
Yeah.
So how does someone go about discovering those if they're not aware of what might be in that collection, the Ansible Windows collection, for example? And there was one more question. How is it retrieving those?
Yep, cool. So basically how you find those collections. So before collections were a thing, as I was saying, we had a whole bunch of them as part of Ansible itself. With the collections move, we sort of split that out into various components. And if you install Ansible, you'll actually find that it comes with a lot of those pre-existing collections. But there's a package called Ansible Core that you can get, which is just basically Ansible itself and no collections. If you go onto Ansible's website, so we've got these Ansible latest collections index.html, we can see a whole bunch of collections on here, which are sort of packaged as part of that sort of bigger Ansible side that we have on there. So Ansible Windows, if we click on that, we can see that it's got a whole bunch of modules that we have on there. So we saw that WinDNS client, which we used before. WinPowerShell was another one that we have on there. WinPing. There's a whole bunch of modules that we have on here. And the Ansible namespace means that it's actually supported by us ourselves. And if you buy support from Red Hat as part of like the Ansible package, we will support those particular modules. The Microsoft.AD one is a new one that's sort of just come out. It's not part of the, actually no, that is a lie. It is part of the Ansible package now. So we've got Microsoft.AD down below. We can see here that the list is a bit shorter, but it still has its own modules on there. So we use things like the membership module to actually join the host, the domain one to create the domain, and the group to actually create the group side. We also have our inventory plugin, which I've talked about before. And basically these docs go through all the options. It shows examples that you can use it on and all the various things that are on there. So we try and be as good with our documentation. Unfortunately, we don't always cover everything, but there's a whole bunch of options on it. Now, your second question as to how does Ansible find them? So basically, I'll show you on PyPI. So PyPI is a Python distribution, so similar to the PowerShell gallery of PowerShell or NuGet for .NET. It has the Ansible package, which is the one that I told you where it's basically Ansible as well as all those other collections all in one sort of package. So you can install that and pretty much get the world. There's another one called Ansible Core, which is strictly Ansible itself, so that engine that you get there and no other collections. Now, in the case here, I actually installed Ansible Core. So if I was to go and open up my requirements, this is a Python file. I'm saying I want to install Ansible Core here, as well as a whole bunch of other packages that are needed for various things. So like DNS Python for the LDAP stuff, PyPSRP for the Windows WinRM support, and the LDAP library here. The collections that I've installed, I'm actually referencing 3 collections. So I'm saying Ansible collections, I want to get Ansible Windows, the chocolatey.chocolatey one, as well as the Microsoft.AD. To run this one here, there's a command called Ansible Galaxy. Collection list will display ones that are actually installed. So in this case here, it's showing us those 3 collections, as well as where they're actually located. But I can also just say Ansible Galaxy collection, and I can point it to that requirements cut file. So we got domain setup, requirements, Ansible.yaml. So if I was to run this one here, no operation needs to happen because it's actually installed, but it'll actually go through your requirements file and install it for you. You can even just do, like if you just know the name, you can do Ansible.windows and it'll install it. Right now, once again, nothing will actually happen there. If you don't like online docs, there's also another tool called Ansible Doc. So in this case here, I've got Microsoft.AD.group, and it'll go through that same documentation that we have on there. So it's showing you all the various options, the documentation for it. And if we go a bit further down, there are a lot of options here. We have our examples. So like it shows you various ways that you can actually use it and stuff like that. Hopefully that answers your question about that one there.
It does, yeah. You went above and beyond. Awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Cool.
I can understand why you would use collections though. Like I was kind of thinking about it. I was like, oh man, there's got to be a lot of modules out there. And then you kind of, there's a lot of similar things there. And it just makes sense to kind of group things together.
There's also something that we call the Ansible Galaxy, which is similar to the PowerShell gallery. So in this case here, it's a repository of third-party things. So historically, Ansible only shipped things called roles, which are sort of a bit more limited with what they can do. They still work, but they're not as functional. Collections were sort of introduced to sort of replace role, well, not replace, but to complement it and offer different functionality. So in this case here, we can see that it actually has our Ansible.windows collection. Gives you sort of the shortcuts on how to install it. You can manually download it if you want to. And a whole bunch of information on there. Just like the PowerShell gallery, the quality of all this sort of ranges from good to sort of a bit more average. So there is sort of a few prolific people that are out there. But in honesty, a lot of the really good ones are sort of packaged as part of that Ansible package that you can get from PyPI, or some distributions still ship.
Mm.
So usually the high quality ones can reach that threshold where we're comfortable to include it as part of that sort of kitchen sink package that we have.
I've got some other questions here. I'm just going to kind of go through them. One of them is from, actually, there's a couple of questions from BW. Is there a reason that the inventory is an INI, not a YAML file?
I personally prefer the INI inventory. You can do a YAML one, but I find INI is actually a lot easier for just sort of the simple stuff. So there's not too much nesting. I find it's quite easy to understand where you have your sort of hosts and then your groups and how you group it. But there is, again, a YAML inventory option. It's just in a different format. I'll see if I can try and get an example of it. So yeah, so we can see here that the INI example, where we have mail.example.com and the various servers, the equivalent in YAML is this particular one here. So you can see that it's a bit more nested. The structure is sort of, I personally think is a bit harder to understand, but you can still do it in YAML if you do want to.
And he, BW also says, is there also a way to have the secret secure rather than in plain text?
Yes. So I briefly talked about that, but I didn't really go into it. It's what we call Ansible Vault. Let me discard these changes. So if you just go into this test one here, we can do our Vault var. So this one here is just going to do, it's going to run this so I can actually display it. So say, for example, we have a variable. I'm just going to call it Vault var. What we can do is that we can do Ansible Vault, I think it's encrypt string. It's been a while since I've actually done this, so I need to, don't know, write it properly. So in this case here, it's asking for a password for the vault. So I'm just going to do the cardinal sin and do password itself. And it's going to spit me back out this sort of random block that we have on here, which is what our vault text is. So what I can do is I can actually copy this. If I go into, let's just create an all, I want to call vault var. And I'm going to set that actual variable here. So in this case here, my group vars for all the hosts will have a vault var set, and the contents will be this vault contents. So if I was to run that playbook, which should be printing out this option here, if I was just to run it by itself, it's going to fail because it can't actually decrypt it. If I provide an option, which is ask vault pass, I can type it in, and it's going to be able to decrypt that for you. So you have your my secret. You can source the variables through files in the actual file system, so you can protect it so only particular users have access to it. There's also more complex things like lookups that you can actually use to be able to retrieve that from things like Azure Key Vault sources or HashiCorp Key Vault lookups and other things like that. But specifically in Ansible, Ansible Vault is the product that we have on there. And if you use AWX or Tower or Control or whatever the hell they're calling it these days, you have a lot more options to sort of protect your secrets. So you're not relying on plain text stuff out there. So there's definitely options for it.
Yeah, cool. Another question, is Ansible native parallel, or do you need to script that in so that it isn't waiting on long running tasks?
So by default, it's controlled under what we call a strategy. Basically, what it does by default is it'll go through step by step in terms of the play. So if we go back to our domain setup, what it's going to do is it's going to run basically through these tasks one by one. It's going to make sure that all the hosts that this play is currently targeting completes before moving on to that next task. So say if I had 3 hosts, it's going to run this file operation on those 3 before moving on to script, before going on, and so on. So you can control it where what we call a free strategy, where basically it's just going to run it on the host. So say, for example, if the second host is taking a longer time to create this folder and the first host finish, the first is just going to continue on to the next step and continue on without waiting for that second one to be done. So you have some control over it. You also have options like, say, if you're targeting 100 hosts or sort of a larger amount, you can batch it up. You can say, okay, run it only on 10% first to make sure that there's no sort of negative impact for actually applying these changes versus running it all at once and blowing away your entire environment. So there's a few options that you have around there to sort of control that type of behavior.
Cool. I just saw that Gavin has just dropped out of the stream, but I'll ask the question on his behalf if he ever pops in and watches the video.
Cool.
Are there any big picture tools that help you to get an overview of a playbook and its scope of work?
That is a good question. I think there's a third-party tool that builds like a graph view that's out there. There's not one in particular that sort of is jumping out in my mind. There's something called, the name's going to escape me now. I think it's Semaphore, maybe? Yeah, Ansible Semaphore. So this is sort of like a third-party solution, which is sort of maybe equivalent to Controller or Tower that we have on there, but they do sort of different things where you can have that sort of high-level overview around Ansible and sort of like a easier overlay of how to organize it. Tower itself also has a concept called workflows where you can combine up your various plays into the different areas and sort of have a workflow, say, okay, this one succeeded, move on to the next one, or if it failed, go into this sort of other one here where you might be able to recover or rescue the particular operations. Apart from that, I can't think of anything else that might sort of give you a brief overview of what's going to happen. The hardest thing is that, like, while you might have modules that sort of are well known with what it can do, with collections or even just sort of the script or the shell modules that you have on there, you can have things where like a tool can't really figure out what's actually happening on it. So it's up to you to provide the context for it. So that makes that sort of operation a bit harder to do.
Okay. I think, Wayne, you have the last question, which is, does the outline view in VS Code work for that? Which I don't.
I guess I was just asking, could you use the outline in VS Code to have a look at the YAML file and get an idea of what's going to happen? It's not as good as what Jordan was showing, but it probably would work. I just use it all the time. The outline like tab in the bottom left-hand corner. Sorry, in the far above timeline NPM scripts, that tab there. What do you even call that?
I don't think so now. I'm actually, I've been saying this for a while now, but I'm in the process of creating a VS Code debugger for Ansible. I can't really demonstrate it right now because it needs a few things to actually set up, but what it should enable is be able to actually set a breakpoint on a particular task and run things through VS Code, and it'll actually stop there and show you the variables that are currently set for all the various hosts, and be able to step in, step over all the other stuff that you used to. And I believe as part of that, it provides that outline to give you, okay, these are all the steps that have actually been found. I could be wrong though. I know it shows it for the debugger. I'm not 100% sure for the outline though.
Okay. That's still pretty cool though. Just like, hey, we can put a debugger on a YAML file.
I think I demonstrated it last year at Ansible Fest but I don't know if they filmed it. It does not look like it. I don't think they recorded it. So unfortunately, you don't have that video of me doing that. But if you're wanting to have sort of a closer look at it, or if you want to ask me any more information about it, I have a repository called Ansibug, which is all the work that are on there. And basically, you should be able to use that today to be able to sort of set it up. So I'll share that link in here.
Yeah, BW just said, wouldn't the answer to be to what does this Ansible script do, be run it through ChatGPT?
You could also do that. I think Red Hat
playground.
probably, or IBM won't like that. They'll want you to use their own product called Lightspeed, but I won't get into the politics on that one there. I also shared the link to this repository, so all those playbooks, as well as the Vagrant file that I used to actually set up all those hosts on the Windows one, are all there. So you should be able to actually follow along and do the various things that I did here today if you're wanting to try it out or play with a few different things. So one thing I do note is that the lap stuff, I needed to actually update the host beforehand. My images aren't new enough to contain the lap's configuration, but that's sort of just a side note.
Cool. That's really, really cool. Alrighty. Anybody else have any other questions? Feel free to just jump in, or feel free to throw questions in chat if you're on Twitch. Yeah, it was really good. It was really, really good.
Yeah. Cool. There's a whole bunch of things. Like, I don't usually use this for Windows. Like, my main dev machine's a Linux one, and I find the hypervisors on there make it a lot easier to set up these environments. But I think I've got about like 6 or 7 different environments for my projects to set up domains and all these various things. And being able to sort of orchestrate it from a central place and handle reboots has just been a godsend. I don't particularly want to think about how to handle that outside of sort of an orchestration tool.
Yeah, that's it. That is literally it. It's like, why should I have to worry about that? Just make it so. Just do it.
Yeah.
I don't care. Yeah. And also, I love the fact that Ansible's idempotent. So it's like you can run it as many times as you want.
It is, but you can still write playbooks that aren't. So we try and make sure our modules are idempotent, but you can only do it to a certain extent. So it also depends on how much effort you're willing to put into it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Alrighty, I don't see any other questions, so I think we might leave it for today. We actually finished on time, which is good. We had finished a little early, and then we had plenty of time for questions. So anyway, thank you so much, Jordan. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on. I think that that talk was just, yeah, it was absolutely amazing. I learned so much, so yeah. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining. If you've got any further questions, Jordan, where can people reach you?
I've got a GitHub, which is jbaran93. I don't think you can actually send messages there, so it's probably not the best place. But
just
I'm a fairly, I'm a fairly frequent lurker in the PowerShell Discord channel, so you'll find me under the same nickname. I'm also a part of IRC, same nickname once again in the Ansible channel. So there's a whole bunch of different locations that you can reach out to me. But I would say either IRC or the Discord, the PowerShell Discord would be best.
Cool. Alrighty. Anyway, without further ado, thank you everybody. I hope you all enjoyed it. And yes, next month is with Gail. If you're interested, I'll be probably throwing that up in the next couple of weeks, the announcement on Meetup. Yeah, and then, yeah, everyone have a good night. And yeah, we'll see you next month. All right. Cheers. Bye. Thanks guys. Bye.